I remember when we had to teach year 6 students about different scientists, and I learned about Mae Jemison, who was the first African-American woman that went to space. And it was just like, wow, I didn't even know that there was like a black female astronaut. For me, I was in my 20s when I learned that. So I imagine we were teaching that to like 10, 11-year-olds, and it's suddenly like, oh, there is someone that looks like me that's done this thing. Basically, you have to take everything that you already know and then challenge it, because you already have a scheme of work or a set of resources that you're just like, oh, I can just use that again. But to keep it relevant and to keep it fresh and to have those, axes of representation, whichever ones it is that you're trying to go for, you have to take a critical thinking approach and challenge your own thought processes about why is it we teach this particular topic.
Hey, welcome back to Adventures in Learning Design, a place to talk about how to design effective learning experiences. My name's Laurie Harrison.
And my name's Laura Patsko, and we're from LearnJam, a purpose-driven learning agency and consultancy.
In this episode, we're talking about the third dimension of inclusive learning design, which is the content and materials that go into our online courses. What can we do to make that content more inclusive and more representative of the learners that we're seeking to help? To explore this, Laura and I had a conversation with Michelle Mangle, who we've been working with as we've been developing our inclusive learning experience design practices. Bit of background about Michelle. Well, actually, Michelle, why don't you tell us?
So I am a educational consultant, but I've got 15 years of experience working with young people in lots of different roles as a family liaison officer, as an education worker, working in widening participation, and also as a teacher in a secondary school. Moving forward, I'm going to be doing more work in EDI around equality, diversity and inclusion, as it seems to be really popular at the moment. There's a lot of call for it. I've worked with quite a varied roster of clients in the last year, ranging from doing resources for young people for Barclays to working on the dimensions with you guys at LearnJam and other resources that I've helped to create for teachers and educators about how to make their curriculums more diverse and more representative of their student bodies.
Right, let's jump in. We started by talking about Michelle's classroom experience.
Do you miss being in the classroom?
No, I don't. I miss young people. I miss working with young people. I don't miss the pressures of being a teacher. You're teaching, your behavioural management, your pastoral support, and sometimes you're just too overwhelmed to do all of it properly. And sometimes you're not trained. Some teachers come straight from uni into the classroom. They've not had support on how to deal with a child with complex needs. I haven't. It's just I went in a bit older and I'd worked in schools already. But, some young people are, particularly now with their mental health, really facing challenges that need to be supported by a range of people, I think.
This really speaks to why I think it was so interesting to work with you when we were looking at the different dimensions of inclusive learning design. Is exactly what you're saying. It's so complex. A whole person comes to a learning experience, and there might need to be a kind of a diagnostic element at some point of okay, they're finding X hard or they're struggling to do Y, but why is that? What lies beneath it, and how can we support that need so they actually get the most out of the learning experience instead of just hoping it were different, pretending that they didn't have certain needs. And it's really complicated to try and hold all of that information about a person, but it's also really necessary if you're going to help them learn something effectively, because you can't just sort of pretend that bit about them isn't true or they're not having this issue or something.
Yeah, and I think COVID highlighted, accessibility. Access to devices, access to I had kids that were, on this intervention project trying to do work on mum's phone, and there's 3 other kids, so they're all vying for this phone, and schools, or councils weren't always as quick on the uptake to get them devices. And at the other end, my partner's a primary school teacher. He's getting hounded by his senior, like SLT, because work's not being completed online and being told, call up so-and-so and say to them, why hasn't your child done this work? And it's just like, it was just that those accessibility and inequalities became really apparent.
Yeah. What's
during COVID.
An SLT? Sorry, can you spell that?
Sorry, senior leadership team. Just management, senior management.
Right. Yeah. So the ones who kind of have an overview of the whole learning system.
That accessibility issue. I mean, actually, that was the original impetus behind LearnJam doing the CDI research project in the first place. Actually, that was kind of where that stemmed from. Is that was starting to get a lot of publicity, and we kept hearing about it, and it was kind of obviously the project that we engaged in then went a hell of a lot deeper than that. But that was the starting point. Was well, if everyone is having to move to online learning suddenly, and big chunks of the population are actually just being left out of this process simply because they don't have access to a device, or there's a shared device within a family. There's all these challenges around that. What are the challenges? What's behind them, and what can people offering online learning do about that? To try and improve that. And that was the original starting point for the whole LearnJam project, which, like I said, it then went quite a lot deeper as we sort of lifted the lid.
Yeah.
It was like, oh, wow, there's a load more here that we never really considered before,
I'd looked at the most up-to-date version, and it's so impressive, like what you've got in there. Like, it's just like, I couldn't see anything that had been not thought of, and I really liked the, under interactions, the potential for integration with assistive technology. I thought that's fantastic, and that's where education needs to be going. We see it on platforms such as Instagram and TikTok, the speech to text, and that makes things so much more accessible for those that need it. And it's really interesting.
Actually, that was one of the most interesting outtakes of this project for me, was the realization. And again, it's one of those things that, like, once it seems so obvious, and you think, why have I never thought of that? But how often things that are initially considered to be like accessibility features or like a special need actually are helpful for so many people in so many contexts.
Yeah.
That if they were just there as part of the standard design process, so many people would benefit, not just people who know or have been told, you need X. So, like, I'm thinking of the example of subtitling, which came up in one of the, it's a common example that's given, is how, like you mentioned, Instagram and TikTok and so on, but often the videos will be subtitled. But I've seen so many people, like, sitting at a bus stop, they don't have headphones, so they're not listening to the video, they're reading the subtitles. Yeah. And whereas initially that would have been considered maybe an accessibility feature, but by catering to the needs of one population, you can actually cover needs of other populations and other contexts and other circumstances. And, it just really spoke to me as an example of why being more inclusive in your approach is just generally good practice.
Yeah, no, definitely. And on that point, I've noticed myself now, when I see videos that don't have the text, I almost switch off a little bit, because I just find it, sometimes you haven't got headphones and you want to watch a video, and it means that you can engage with it if the text is there. You can mute your phone and you can just read it. But when it doesn't have that, I'm kind of like, I'll have to watch that later.
It's interesting, isn't it? It's almost the default now is to watch, especially on social media, to watch, is to watch videos with the closed captions rather than with audio. And sometimes they say, the post will say, make sure you put the audio on for this one, because it's, oh, okay.
Yeah. When thinking of like students where English is an additional language, I often would make sure the captions were on and pray that the captions were accurate, because I'm sure you've both come across when captions haven't been accurate or substitute words, you're like, that's not quite right. But it's really helpful for them, if English isn't their first language, to be able to read along, and they'll get more out of it.
So we thought it'd be really interesting to talk to you particularly about the materials dimension of our ILXD dimensions, because we know that you do a lot of material design and resource design and so on. And one of the points that obviously spoke to us, because our backgrounds at LearnJam, a lot of us worked in language teaching and language education. And this was also something I remember you mentioning when we were developing the ILXD dimensions, is, have we factored in the language of instruction in here somewhere? What about students whose first language isn't English? And this is just one of the points that ended up in that kind of micro level of the ILXD dimensions, of like at a very specific, very concrete, like what is on the page. Why does that matter so much? I think we have opinions on that. I'd be interested to know in your experience and your opinion, because I think it often gets overlooked particularly in communities where there is a majority language and where a lot of the people using that language are monolingual. So they might not have that perspective of what it feels like. But from your experience, why was that such an important point to you to mention that for inclusivity, the language used in material and tasks is really important?
Yeah, I think I was thinking about this, and I was thinking about how language often defines us, but also binds us as well, because when we are excluded from language, then it's like we're not acceptable, we're not seen. But at the same time, when we are seen in language, that gives us that representation. And I was thinking in particular about, using gender neutral names and pronouns in the resources that I've been creating. And this was something that was picked up on. And I said, they were like, oh, you use they the whole time. And I said, I did it deliberately because it's important for our LGBTQ plus students, and we don't have to default all the time to he and she. We can use they as well to be inclusive, and that's it. That'll be important for someone that will see that and feel like, oh, I've been seen, I'm being recognized in a way that other students, when it's he and she, are recognized all the time. So I just thought, learning about who we are in the external world, it's often through language, whether it's spoken or written, but particularly for students, the written word is really important. They have to read constantly, and making it more inclusive is important for them to be able to connect more with the text or the activity.
And words have power, don't they? I mean, the words that we choose are very powerful and very meaningful, and particularly to younger people, but not only. But at that sort of stage of life where you really are sort of figuring out your identity or kind of evaluating it, let's say analyzing it for the first time, the words we choose can make a huge difference to how we see ourselves.
Yeah, and I also thought about, when creating resources, the names that we use, do we always default to British names when actually across the UK there's huge diversity in classrooms, and that being a really simple thing that teachers can do, like looking at their classrooms and going, actually, do my resources, the students that we're using as examples, do they reflect the classroom? And if they don't, that's a really simple thing you can do straight away.
How many kids have I got in my class called John or Jane?
Probably
none.
Probably none.
Yeah.
And but also I was thinking about this as well when I was reflecting over the questions that you posed, and I thought, even if you do I've taught out, when you come out of London, you do teach in classes that are more monocultural, and for them then it's a learning opportunity that there are different cultures, etc., that exist, because then it's like, I don't know that name, where's that name from? Like it's there's a learning opportunity because I think that's the working within like racial equity, etc., and diversity. It's some people will go, well, we don't need to do this because our company culture is, there's not many people here that are actually diverse. But it's like, this is still a learning opportunity for you to see the world is bigger than this, as when you're thinking about yourselves as like, global citizens, for example. It's bigger than just the UK. London is a hub for diversity, but why can't that be reflected in the wider teaching resources, as it were? Just something I was reflecting on.
And I think it's interesting as well, because I remember having a similar conversation with somebody once about multilingualism and diversity, and saying how we often think of it as relating to like a lot of individuals in a group or in a society or in a neighborhood. But even within one individual, you have multiple dimensions and multiple not personalities, multiple identities. We were talking about multilingualism, and we were sort of relating it to intersectionality and saying how, your different characteristics and identities work together to create who you are. So that idea of like, it's not either or, you know? And it's not just about this person in this classroom has this name or that person has that name, but maybe I have different names I use with different members of my family, or a nickname, or I have an identity that relates to my race, my ethnicity, my gender, and so on. So like you say, I think that makes for a really valuable learning opportunity for people to see that it's complex and there can be a lot buried beneath something that seems as simple as a name. What person does that name represent? And how can we get to know them?
Yeah, definitely.
There's a kind of a classic example, isn't there, of Chinese people when they come to live in the West tend to pick or choose an English name. And I've seen kind of both sides of that argument, I guess, as to whether that's a good or a bad thing. It's kind of, I'm not clear myself, actually. But
yeah, that's a really good example. And I also saw a TikTok, which was a Black student of African heritage, give an example of names that are Celtic in origin. So Siobhan, Sinead, etc. And was like, you can learn, and obviously the spellings of these names in particular don't match up with how you say them when they have traditional spellings. And they were like, you can learn how to say all of these names, but you can't learn how to say my given name. And just pointing out the hypocrisy in that, you know, if which is really interesting, because it's kind of like, you know, I think the Chinese example is that they've just thought, we're not even going to bother with that. We're not going to bother with you murdering our names. We're going to give you a name that you can say, which is one way to deal with it. Or it's actually like, you know, I've had kids in my class whose names I've got wrong. And it's been really difficult, and they would have to say, the kids would be like, no, miss, it's blah, 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 blah. And I'd be like, I'm really sorry. And I'd apologize straight away and be like, I haven't read your name before. So if I say this out loud and it's wrong, please correct me. But yeah, we do culturally, that we do learn certain names and how to say certain things. Like, you know, think about football players. My brother can, you know, all these weird and wonderful surnames that people have, that, you know, he can learn how to say those surnames because they're familiar to him in the context of football. But in other contexts, like, you know, people don't feel as comfortable, such as in education. So I think context and modelling, it's okay to mess up and say things wrong, but the main thing is you're trying to say it. And there's been some examples as well, like, you know, of young people. I read when I was doing some research around this, of young people, like, you know, saying that, you know, they've had teachers that just refused to use their names and gave them other names, or just, you know, consistently mispronounced their name, which is really like, you know, horrible, like in a group setting. And you think that's really unpleasant. And then you as a young person, are you going to engage with that teacher, like when they can't even get your name right, or give you another name that's not your name?
It's a very quick way to switch off, isn't it?
Yeah.
I remember having I for the past few summers I've taught in classes where you brought up the example of a lot of students from China. Laurie, I had a lot of students from China, also some from South Korea. But those are the main backgrounds. And I remember us talking about this and the reasons behind. So they didn't all use a different name than their given name in Chinese. Some of them did. And we talked a bit about it. And I found it a really nice example of just how, I mean, again, there's like this common risk of imagining whole populations as kind of, what do they think? But all the students in my classroom had different reasons for the name they chose as well. So again, it comes down to like, it's not even so much about, it is about the name, but it's not even so much about the name as about the choice and just the opportunity to say, this is who I am. And so some of them had been, as you say, kind of given names by teachers who'd said, okay, this is your English name. You know, that's it. When they were sort of 5 years old, this is the name you're going to use. Some of them had chosen their own. And some of their choices were quite unusual and names I hadn't encountered before, or names that they used as their name, but weren't typical names. They were sort of words or English words that they liked the sound of, or maybe sounded similar to their given name in Chinese. And so the reasons for choosing these names were as diverse as the names themselves. And that discussion also helped us get to know them as people. So again, it's like a nice example of how something that seems like a simple question of representation at one point actually just scratches the surface of a person's identity. How they made it to your classroom, what was their path, what's their background, what do they bring to the learning experience, and all of this in a name. What started as a question of like, shall we call this character Jane or John, becomes this great big discussion.
There's a lot of nuance there, isn't there? It's not sort of it's not clear cut necessarily.
That's the word. Nuance.
When I did French at school, secondary school, I was Laurent. We had to have a French name, so I guess I mean, fairly straightforward because that's just the French version of my name. But
right.
we were all given French names by the teacher, and then had to kind of use those. I'm just hadn't thought about that for 30 years, but it just reminded me.
How do you feel about it now?
I feel all right about it. Yeah, I don't think we were particularly bothered, but it wasn't. No. I don't know. I don't think it didn't feel like we were taking on different identities or anything by using those names. It was just a bit of fun, I think.
And I think in like one class, then it might be fine because it's within the context of a language class, and that. But I think when I liked what you said, Laura, about some of them choosing, take active choice. I'm choosing to give myself a different name for this context. And some of them may well be used to having different names for different contexts because they're within their culture. That is a normal thing, But when it's a case of like someone choosing a name for you because they can't be bothered to pronounce your name, learn how to pronounce your name properly, then that's a different thing.
I think that's the key distinction, isn't it? Really, yeah. It's like you said, if it's hey, I like this name. I'd like this to be my almost like an alter ego or a different version of my identity. And people have different names for different contexts quite often. But if it's just like you said, I can't be bothered to learn how to pronounce your name because it's slightly difficult, even though I could if I tried. So I'm just going to call you this instead. That's just insulting, really, isn't it? And lazy.
Yeah.
Next, we wanted to move on to talk about representation within learning materials.
I'm kind of reminded of a much bigger question, or bigger, I mean a broader, sort of more vague question they've sort of touched on, which is just that of representation in general. I mean, maybe let's ask the obvious question of why does any of this matter? Why does it matter if I see someone like me in my textbook?
Yeah, well, when I looked at that question, I was like, the first thing that came to my mind is the saying, you can't be what you can't see. And, if you don't see yourself reflected in the textbook, or you're only ever reflected in the textbook as a subjugated person or a slave, or, as due to colonialism, then it's really problematic. And I think that's one of the things, with broadening the narratives around different ethnic groups, it's not just about them being persecuted, but also to, write that narrative is about focusing on the gains and the contributions that different individuals have had. And, I remember when we had to teach year 6 students about different scientists, and I learned about Mae Jemison, who was the first African-American woman that went to space. And it was just like, wow, I didn't even know that there was like a Black female astronaut. And it just, and for me, I was in my 20s when I learned that. So I imagine we were teaching that to like 10, 11-year-olds, and it's suddenly like, oh, there is someone that looks like me that's done this thing. And I think it's like, really important. It helps again with that connection with the materials, that it's hard because sometimes students can be a little bit like, I don't, they want to be part of the main culture. They don't want their culture emphasized. But I still think it's important because not all classrooms are monocultural, and you want them to connect with the text, with the materials, and give other children different learning opportunities as well, because this is the thing, we have to think about the whole classroom. So this group of kids gets represented, and then maybe the predominant culture get to learn something new, because being in the UK in particular and being an island, we can be a bit insular, whereas if we were like in Europe where your borders, it's easy. I'm not saying there's not problems with racism in other European countries, but I think there's a different feeling around being European, for example, when you're not on an island.
Certainly,
And do you think
linguistic terms, I think.
Yeah.
There's that expectation of I travel 10 kilometers and I switch language, which is not necessarily dissimilar to cities like London or Birmingham or other parts of the UK. But I think that, on a national level and a culture and the kind of unwritten rules and expectations of a society, I would tend to agree. In my experience, there's a difference in the sort of island nation.
I remember when I went on a school trip to Belgium, and it was one of those exchange programs, and there were people there that could speak French, and they could also speak, what was the other language? There was another language, and like I was so impressed. You're just like, oh my god, you can speak 3, and they can speak English as well. And you're like, you can speak 3 languages, and I can only speak 1, and it's because they're aware of their their place within. If I go to this part of Belgium, I'm going to need to be able to speak French. And if I'm in a different part, I'm going to need to have to speak another language. And I'm also going to need to use English for work or for school. And, it's always incredible when, you go to Sweden or Finland, they speak perfect English. And their languages is like, I don't know if you've ever tried to learn Finnish or Swedish, but they're very difficult. Completely different.
Finnish is off the scale, difficult for
I'm working on Greek at the moment and it's hard enough.
Okay, so yes.
I'm not going to get to finish anytime soon. We're back on language again. I feel like we can always go down the rabbit hole of language because there's so much to be said there. But one thing that you mentioned a second ago is about I forget how you phrased it, Michelle, but the kind of, like there's life outside our classroom sort of thing, like particularly if you're, wherever you're from. So now let's imagine, language and nation regardless, but let's imagine a younger person who's studying in a context where most of the other people in their classroom have similar backgrounds to them. And how representation in materials can be about representing the wider world. And I remember thinking as a young person sometimes when there were things in the textbook that weren't familiar, without kind of being explicitly told, like, this is a useful learning opportunity, I would sometimes confuse not familiar with not relevant. And then I would switch off. Because I would think, why do I need to know this? I'm never going to go there. I'm never going to need this. I'm never going to use that. I don't want to be a musician, an architect, whatever the thing was. Like, so not even just about sort of representation of identity, but those maths problems where they're like, a train is leaving this origin at 15 kilometers an hour and a train is, and I'm thinking, I never take the train. Why do I care? So what is the relationship then between representation and relevance? Like, again, we talked a bit about like, why does it matter? Why does representation matter? Why does relevance matter? And what can we do if learners don't, if we as learning designers are putting together materials because we think actually it's relevant to the world, but their world is a smaller place. Again, does it matter? Why does it matter to show them worlds they might not inhabit or be interested in or find familiar?
Just to broaden their worldview. I think it's really important that, when I went to university, I did it because I wanted to get a degree, but I also wanted to know more about the world. And, I wanted to know more than just what I had experienced so far. And I think skilled teachers can make subjects that aren't particularly interesting relevant to them. And, that's part of being a skilled educator. Like, you don't see the relevance of it now, but it actually will be. And you also don't know what's going to spark something off in a young person. We've all had teachers that have said something or told us about something that's, led to a lifelong interest in something that we may never have done. And that's because they were either passionate about their subject or they were able to bring out the story of what was happening and made it really interesting. I was also thinking about, a lot of the UK curriculum, it doesn't make explicit how this is relevant to you in the future.
Right. Like, that was my experience.
But like, think about it, like pensions, mortgages, paying taxes. You learn all the skills to work out these things in maths and the history of how these things, inflation, for example. You know, our political parties, why do we have first past the post? All of this like could be made a lot more explicit, like, you know, for young people, instead of being like, you're going to be taught this because this is how we teach it.
Right.
And I think
and this will be in the exam. So
and this will be exactly
gosh,
rather than making it, you know, explicit, like, you know, learning about voting, because you are going to get the vote when you're 18. You know, this is what the different political parties stand for. Do you want to have a say in how this country's run? Like, you know, all these, like, you know, this is the history of how the UK came to have this legal system and stuff like that. I think a lot of kids would actually be really interested, like, you know, in the formation of the police, for example. How did the police actually come into being? You know, it's really interesting. And that was something I learned about when I didn't learn about that until I went to university, and because I did criminology modules. But a lot of kids would actually be really interested in that. And, you know, kids, you know, financial literacy, you know, just we've all, you know, when I'm trying to think about pensions and stuff like that, and, you know, as a freelancer trying to work out taxes and, you know, all this stuff, you know,
all of a sudden it matters. Damn, I wish I'd listened to Mrs. Whoever when I was 15.
I wish I'd remember how to calculate percentages in my head without having to go, you know. And I wrote down the example of, like, for like young people, you want to buy, you know, the latest trainers, or you want to buy the latest gadget and it's on sale. This is how you work it out. You know, it's very easy to make it real life examples. But I think good teachers do that. I think good teachers do make those explicit ones. But I know, like, you know, I'm trying not to, you know, teachers have so much to do, and I can imagine, you know, because they are data driven and they have to get results, sometimes it is, as you said, Laurie, focused on what's kind of come up on the paper and the exam and stuff like that. And, you know, they're not taught in a broader way of, like, you know, we're going to talk about Victorian writers, they've got to learn about Dickens. But what did Victorian writers give to the world? What were the themes that were being, you know, wrote about that weren't being wrote about before, and why is that important now? It's hard, it's difficult if you're time pressured and you're just like, I've got to get these results.
So it all becomes quite abstract and sort of disconnected, and it's sort of making those connections to your life, or, you know, your concerns or your motivations. That's what really makes it hit home, I think. But if it's just an abstract concept or a piece of information that you need to memorize because it's going to come up in a test or whatever, because it's on the syllabus and that's it, that's why you need to know it, then
sounds like a recipe for disengagement, doesn't it?
Absolutely.
And lack of motivation.
So that naturally led the conversation on to talking about engagement and motivation.
It strikes me that this issue of relevance is really connected to engagement in education. You know, why am I even here? Why am I learning this? Why should I care? That big question, you know. Well, here's why. And not because I say so. That's not the answer. The answer is like a real example, like you said, because at some point you're going to be thinking about your pension and you're going to want to calculate this, and then it's going to matter, you know, or whatever other example. But yeah, those big kind of the R's, the representation and relevance, are something, I guess. You talked a lot about the pressures on teachers and all of the many demands that we make on teachers and educators. And I feel like maybe this is why there's still a role for, you know, expert materials design and content creation, is because the people at the end of the day who might be using that material will have numerous other demands on their attention and time and skills. So
I think that's a really good point, Laura, actually, because if for most teachers, they know how to teach, they've been trained in how to teach, but it's often, you know, what teachers often say is, I don't have the time to go and research all the relevant Black history to make my subject more, you know, diverse. I just don't have the time. So if there's resources that have done that for them, then they can just roll with it, and it makes their life a lot easier. So I think there definitely, you know, is a real need for that at the moment.
Yeah, I don't have the time. I feel like of all the years I spent teaching and conversations I've had with teachers and training sessions I've been to or given or whatever, that not having the time to do the job that the way you'd like to do it. However much in principle you want to make things more inclusive, more diverse, and so on, you're going to need support. from the system you're working in. And that could be the material you're teaching from, or your senior leadership team, or your colleagues, even the students themselves, supporting, bringing their knowledge and their experience to bear on the learning experience.
Yeah, no, definitely. And this relates to like one of the things that you were asking about to do with constructing a syllabus, like, what's the best way to do this? And I was thinking about it, and I was like, basically you have to take everything that you already know and then challenge it, because you already have a scheme of work or a set of resources that you're just like, oh, I can just use that again. But to keep it relevant and to keep it fresh and to have those, axes of representation, whichever ones it is that you're trying to go for, you have to take a critical thinking approach and challenge your own thought processes about why is it we teach this particular topic? What else was happening in the world? Because I've been learning a little bit more, I've just been reading different things recently, and I was reading about China and, the revolution that happened there, and then the Japanese colonizing them. And I was like, why are we taught this? Why are we not taught history in a much broader sense? Because it intersects with the UK and immigration in such interesting ways. But sorry, not to digress, but I just was thinking about, like SOAS, for example, have a really good toolkit for decolonizing your curriculum, and that's something I've wrote about before. And the need for a collaborative approach. Just because you don't know something doesn't mean that other people don't know it. You never know what your colleagues' interests are, and what they might bring to the table. But again, it's about having that time to be able to do that. And the young people themselves are a great resource. What do they want to learn about? What would they be interested in? When I had to teach a unit on like war and conflict, I was like, here are all the different conflicts we can learn about. Which ones do you want to learn about? Which ones are relevant? And they wanted to learn about specific ones. And then I was like, right, okay, I'll go off and create over half term.
That's exactly what I was just thinking, because I was thinking earlier, you mentioned Mae Jemison as an astronaut, who a lot of people probably haven't heard of and don't know about. And I was just thinking that, how like if you as the teacher know the principles of what you're going to teach, so you mentioned war and conflict, but the students say, these are the ones I'm interested in, then you can marry them together and make something really relevant for your class. So if it were the case that you were looking at engineering, or you were looking at space exploration, or I don't know, life in the, I'm trying to think what era Mae Jemison was, 60s, 70s? But yeah, if that was your context, you could bring in examples that were not the standard examples, and thereby broaden the exposure of the students to more ideas, more people, more backgrounds, more personality, more stories. You mentioned stories as well. And I think the stories students hear about people like them or not like them are really powerful in their experience. But then again, there comes the challenge to materials writers, is how do you do that when you're producing material that is meant to be used by a very wide range of people everywhere? Is that individual relevance becomes part of the mediation of the material, I guess.
I think that the young people are a really good resource, and I think it's important to engage them as much as you can where you have that space. The teachers will know that there's places where they have a little bit more space they can't do everything, but they could rejig this, if that makes sense. And thinking about, I was reminded when I was thinking about this, about Paulo Freire, and where he said in the Pedagogy of the Oppressed about it not being top down learning, but students as active learners as a form of social justice, them getting involved and just making decisions and going off and investigating. I've said to students before, I said I gave them a homework where they had to go and research a person from the Afro-Caribbean community, and just was like, literally, you've got someone starting with A, B, C. So I didn't even know what they were going to come up with. I just knew.
Just pick someone.
Just pick someone beginning with the letter D. And so they all went off and had to, do that. And, and stuff to do with LGBT history as well is really important, I think, because it's not stuff that they necessarily would think to unless it was relevant to them. But I think teachers have a lot of power to kind of think, oh, actually I could just get this in there, I could just slip this in there. But it's to do with whether they're willing to do that, and how interested they are in education as a social justice tool as well.
I really like that idea of giving them kind of just enough structure to get going down whatever route they find interesting. So you're able to sort of say, okay, here's the topic. I want you to research someone. It has to start with D. Off you go.
Mm-hmm.
Then, that gives them enough specificity to channel their energy, like to refine their search at the beginning, but it gives them enough broadness to go, oh, this person's called this person's called that. I like the sound of that. I'll follow that one, and just kind of, follow their own interests and still come back to you having done the task, but done it in their own way, in a personal way. Yeah. They've identified at every step what's relevant. I really like that idea. And that to me strikes me as something that could be factored into static content, to be given enough structure to start the ball rolling.
Yeah.
And to trust whoever it is who mediates that content, a teacher, a tutor, or whoever, a parent, the learner themselves, enough freedom to kind of continue the ball rolling, if I can extend that metaphor.
We then moved on to talk about different aspects of representation and what that means.
We talked earlier about representation, and I think it often, and I myself am guilty of this, it often gets, that word gets thrown around in very two-dimensional terms of like, what biological sex a character is in a book, or what color their skin is. But representation is also about representation of experience, lived experience, opinions and views and so on. And it makes me think that if we're talking about representation in learning materials, things like this conversation we're having, where we swap perspectives, experience, share personal stories, that's also a way of representing other people's lives and understanding why other people in society might disagree with us, for example. It's not just about the facts as presented on a page. What is fact? Who decides what's fact? Who made this curriculum? Why did they decide to include this and not include that? What was their experience? Why did they think this was important? And all of this kind of questioning leads us to a point where we can actually participate in society and have differences of opinions and so on. So, I suppose that's another aspect of representation.
Yeah, definitely that kind of critical thinking analysis of like, why has this been chosen to be put on the syllabus, and like who's teaching it and how are they teaching it and the methods that they're using. I also was thinking about the advent of fake news as well. And that's something now that educators have to navigate that they wouldn't have had to navigate before. And, we've just seen this massive, spike in people, particularly around creating fake news about the vaccines, which is a really creative endeavor. Ultimately, it is, but it's also like, teaching people the skills to be able to interrogate something, because, a young person reads something and they're just like, oh, but I read this on this website, and not having the skills to kind of like do what you just said, Laura, interrogate it. Like, how do we know this is truth? How do we know this is real? And that's only going to grow more complicated as the world keeps on going, because there's always going to be opposing forces. And as we've seen, like with the vaccine debate, some people really stringently believing this is not the right thing to do, and others saying it is. But then the advent of fake news confuses everybody. When I've been speaking to young people about the vaccination and stuff like that, they're confused. They don't know who to trust, and how do we know this is right? And and then you follow potentially what just other people do, because it's easier to do that than because you don't necessarily have the skills to interrogate things yourself.
It's a kind of critical analysis ability, critical thinking, and media literacy, so that you can unpick all those issues and work out who you trust and why. And it makes me think as well how much of our debate around this, and I mean our in the very general sort of educator sense and in the very specific sense of this podcast, but how much is informed by our own Western / global North / Anglophone sense of what authority is in education and who to trust, and that it seems to come to the three of us quite naturally now to think, well, yeah, of course you would question what people tell you. But I know I've taught students before who, when I've asked them for an opinion or a position on something, which I think is pretty trivial, what do you want to do this activity or this one? They say, whatever you think, teacher. Because from their background, I have an authority as a teacher and an educator that I should tell them, and they defer to that. And it's not because they couldn't think critically or creatively, but they believe it's wrong in that context to do so, and they want me to have the authority and to impose that. And so even this kind of conversation is complicated by that layer of culture and expectation of how much choice learners should have, or who they should trust and why, and should they question that trust, and so on. Which again, coming back to material and what you create and who's going to use it in the end becomes this huge can of worms.
Yeah, and I think sometimes you don't realise that students have those cultural biases until you're like there in front of them going, come on, what do you want to do? And they're like, no, it's fine. And you're like, no, you choose. And then they're like, and then you realise that, and this is just my personal experience. I've often found it's been girls from specific cultural backgrounds that are just kind of like, no, you choose, it's fine. I don't have an opinion on this. And you start to realize okay, I'm going to have to actually tell you now just to do this. Otherwise you're not going to do it. And that does come from, I guess, being educated in the West ourselves, and then using those methods in classrooms where there's children that may not have those methods of learning and teaching. Having to be constantly flexible around that is something you have to learn.
It's challenging and it's tiring. And in my personal opinion, it's valuable, but it's you said something you have to learn.
And sometimes it's easier for you when you're knackered and you're just like, can you all do activity A, please? And it's just easy because you for whatever reason you're just like, I just need to get this done. But sometimes you want them to kind of be a bit more like, no, and I guess as well, it's the extent to which you build into your planning that flexibility where you can choose to do task A, B, or C, but then you have to have had the time to create 3 different tasks that all have the same outcomes, that they'll still learn something. And obviously allowing for the bias of the students, will always go for the easiest one.
Of course.
If you grade the activities in order of difficulty, I found that before, even the really bright kids are going for the easiest one, and you're like, no, you probably should do D. I think that'd be better for you. And they're like, no, I just want to do this one. And you're like, okay, fine. Can you try D afterwards?
You end up in this sort of tangled negotiation with a battle of wills. But actually, I like that idea of planning to be flexible, like baking in flexibility. And that, again, seems like a more, albeit time-consuming, but more inclusive way of putting together a course and course content, is saying there's a certain syllabus that has been devised in a certain way that's going to be covered. And in order to work your way through it, you have some choice over whether you do A, B, or C. But hopefully people will make it to the end point they're all supposed to make it to by their own routes. And if that can be kind of baked in, that flexibility, then I guess it makes it a bit easier to execute and more likely that you'll capture the needs of more students rather than just going, this is the way we do it.
Yeah, and that also leads on to one of the questions that you asked about, how do we be smarter in how we assess learning? And I was thinking about this having been a teacher and having to be very data driven. And actually what I think is best for young people is, ipsative assessment, where they're just assessed from, this is where you were at the beginning and now here's where you are 3 months later, and not them being compared to this is the average for the class and all the different ways that it's often this is the year group or this is the class and this is where they should be. This pre-prescribes this student they came in at level X and now they should be at level X.2. It's really frustrating because as well it sets them up for feeling like a failure because they're going to be like, well, why haven't I got to this level? And actually there might have been things that have been happening at home that have meant they've not been able to study, or they find this subject particularly difficult. But I was thinking about it even in a human context, because like a coach that I follow, he talks about this notion of the gap and the gain. And, we all have this ideal that we look up to for whatever it is that we want to achieve. But actually, if you go to yourself, last year in relation to this goal, I was here and now I'm here, then you kind of feel more positive about it rather than going, I'm still nowhere near to that ideal.
Right.
I give the example of my novel that I'm still working on, but I want to finish the novel. That's the end goal, to finish this novel. But if I think, oh God, well, I've only wrote, like, I don't even know how many words I've wrote. I'm nowhere near finishing. I'm still at the midpoint of the book. But then if I go, actually, from this point last year, you've actually, you've done these courses, you've revised chapters, you've wrote new material, and I start to think of all the things I actually have achieved, then I can go, actually, I've done quite a lot. Yeah. And I am on my way to achieving that, but I'm only comparing myself to myself. I'm not comparing myself to anybody else in my class or that I know, because I've got other friends that are writers. It's about keeping it narrowly focused on where was I last year and where am I now in relation to this. And I think,
which is what you referred to as ipsative assessment, right? Because I think that's a term that you actually introduced me to some time ago. I knew the concept, but not the term. But yeah, that strikes me as a very kind of an almost obvious way to personalize learning. If you're only ever comparing you to you, then like you say, you're not set up for failure so much. It's all relative to where you were before.
Well, ipsative assessment was certainly a new one for me. It was time to wrap up the conversation, and Michelle left us with a bit of historical perspective.
I had just like one example of to do with history, about, when you asked about why is it important for learners and identities and experiences to be reflected in learning materials. And I just got a little note here saying, and more accurate retelling of history, so it's not one-sided, that we came and we conquered and then, this is what it was. And I gave that, the example of China and their own internal revolution and then being colonized by the Japanese and, the rise of communism there is really, really fascinating. And I think that's important for us to learn. But then also, until I went to an exhibition once at the Imperial War Museum and learnt about all the different, like, African, Caribbean, the Gurkhas, all the people that had contributed to the World War efforts, that's never highlighted. I don't ever remember that being taught in school when I learned about, and we all learn about, we often learn about World War II more than World War One. I think I learned about World War One in A level, but the contributions of those groups is really, really important. And the role of different LGBT individuals in championing like rights for different groups as well is really important. But we're not taught these things. It's taught in isolation, and it's like it should be just part of it. That's just, I guess, something that I think is really important.
Well, it's about understanding our present through the lens of history as well, isn't it? When people think something is new, it's never happened before, or the world was better then, some golden age where things were how they want them to be. And it's like, actually, there have been all kinds of events and voices and personalities throughout history that maybe we just haven't learned about because they weren't in the standard curriculum.
Yeah.
But that doesn't mean they didn't exist or don't need to be known about. Michelle, I could talk to you for hours. I was so grateful for you being our guest today. Thank you. I feel like there's so many more seeds we've just sort of conversations and to be had. Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah, no worries. I'm glad that it's been useful. We've covered a lot. We've covered a lot in this time. Like
wide ranging. Yeah.
Yeah, definitely. It's going to be really interesting when you edit it down, like, because it's so broad. But sometimes that's really interesting to kind of like look at things in broader notes and then focus in.
I think so. Yeah. Yeah.
And what a nice metaphor for everything we've been saying as well. Like this, you take all this stuff and edit it into something coherent that's a nice story.
Yeah.
Adventures in Learning Design is brought to you by LearnJam. You can find out more about us and the work that we do at learnjam.com. And if you're interested to learn more about inclusive learning design and to download our ILXD dimensions, then head over to learnjam.com/resources.